Hello, everyone. You're listening to episode 6 of The Mental Lotline. The Mental Lotline is a podcast made by your friendly neighborhood teens and brought to you by the Laugh Out Together Foundation. My name is Alex Kim, and I'm joined by my good friend Tracy Lay.
As always, we're here to discuss all aspects of mental health, how we're affected by our circumstances, and what we can do about it. Please be sure to check us out on social media on Instagram at LOT_foundation. And please consider donating to our PayPal, which is linked in the link tree in our Instagram bio.
That being said, today we'll be learning about addictions and substance abuse. Addiction is a treatable, chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. Often associated with addiction is substance abuse, which is often known as an overindulgence in or dependence on an addictive substance, especially alcohol or drugs. As teens, we've always been told from a young age that doing drugs is bad for us, but as it turns out, the physical effects are only half the story. The peer pressure of taking drugs, as well as the psychology of addiction, all take a part in the complexity of the mental effects of drugs.
To guide us through the mental aspect of substance abuse, we are honored to introduce our esteemed guest, Mr. Ross Phillips. Mr. Ross Phillips is a licensed marriage and family therapist, medical assistant, addictions treatment counselor, who also has a master's degree in clinical psychology. Mr. Phillips has his own services called Ross Phillips Therapy, where he specializes in aiding the lives and relationship of those who suffer from substance abuse. Mr. Phillips, welcome to the Mental Hotline.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here.
Jumping right into it, so it's such a big topic that substance abuse and as well as addiction is. I think a good way that our listeners could get to learn about it is at its core, what is an addiction and what are some of the key features that we can identify from an addiction?
Yeah, I think your definition that you opened with, Alex, was quite good. To expand on that, addiction can be use or dependence on a substance or a behavior as well, where we engage in this behavior or using of these drugs, even though we continue to engage in them, even though it's causing us physical or psychological damage. So, examples of that are using, even, cognitively, we know this is not working for us, yet we continue to do it over and over again.
So often addiction is characterized by, if I understand correctly, having a dependence on a sort of substance, but at the same time knowing the consequences of using it, but also being unable to separate yourself from the action because it's so deeply ingrained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. So our brain is separated into three different areas: our neocortex, which is our human brain, driven, by our prefrontal cortex, which is the logical, rational brain. And then we have our subcortical brain, or more mammalian brain, and then a reptilian brain, which is the brainstem area. So, our cognitive brain is saying, no, this is not good. If I go out and drink this beer, I know, my history tells me that I can't just stop with one beer. I'm going to have 10 beers, or I can't, if it's 10:30 at night and I really, I've got a big day at school tomorrow, but I'm just going to go just play a little bit of this video game that I like, and it'll last half an hour. And 2 o'clock in the morning rolls around and here I am, I'm still doing it. But I will do it even though I know that things are going to go badly. I will do it anyway. Or I will fool myself, and then there's a state of denial where I don't acknowledge this. I'm within denial myself of acknowledging that there's a problem. And I think things will happen differently each time I do it.
I see. So you mentioned that addictions have different neurological effects for our bodies. Well, is there always a net negative effect on addiction, or could there be some kind of positive effect to addiction on that as well?
Right, great question. So kind of by definition, and we didn't mention this, but not perhaps a strict definition, but it's addiction. For me, part of the definition is that things will go bad for us. We're struggling in our jobs or in school or relationships due to these addictive behaviors. So is there a net negative? Not over time. No, I wouldn't say so, because it's kind of part of that definition that it's negatively impacting us psychologically, behaviorally, relationally, for example.
I see. That's very interesting. You mentioned earlier something that I found kind of interesting, and I think that a lot of people could relate to. You mentioned that often, well, I'll preface this by saying that often drugs and alcohol are often associated with addictions. But then you also mentioned, as kind of a side tangent, the fact that other things such as video games or other distractions in our lives could also become addictions. Is there always, let's see, is there always a type of addiction, such as to drugs or alcohol, that is often considered to be worse or more negatively affected than those of other ones, such as, like you said, video games? Or basically what I'm saying, is there like a system to which
hierarchy, perhaps?
A hierarchy, yes. Is there a hierarchy to addictions?
Yeah, no, yeah, there is. I mentioned video games. Gambling is an addiction, and shopping is an addiction. I have clients who are addicted to shopping, or other behaviors like that. So, sure, what are the consequences of, let's say, I can't stop shopping on Amazon, or I'm gambling and I'm losing my money. So that's awful. That can be, you could lose your home, you lose your family, your kids' college fund. I mean, there's obviously the damage can be extremely concerning and horrible. When we're addicted to things like drugs, like cocaine or alcohol or methamphetamine or opioids is huge. We know people die from that. So of course, then that would kind of speak to your hierarchy. One could argue that dying is worse than losing all your money. So sure, drugs, especially opioids, and over the long term, alcohol can be bad, as can things like speed, like cocaine and methamphetamine. And then, of course, there's the less obvious, perhaps when we first look at it, death, maybe not by overdose, but by car accidents or winding up in jail, or killing somebody else by accident. Obviously, these are all horrible things that are more likely to happen in an addiction to a substance as opposed to addiction to a video game, for example.
I see.
So there has been many cases, including mine, where I have a loved one or a close family member that has possibly been addicted to illegal drugs like opioids and other non-over-the-counter drugs. And so you mentioned how addiction has affected the person that is consuming it. How about the difference? How about what is the difference in the effect of maybe different age groups, such as a teen or maybe an adult, to someone who has an addiction to those drugs? What is the difference basically in maybe their reactions and how they respond to their loved ones being addicted?
Okay, so I heard maybe two questions, and that's fine. I think what I heard you ask really is about, let's start with the family members. addiction, certainly as we call it, those of us who work professionally with addiction call it a family disease. It's never, like an addict might say, "What's wrong, man? It's just me. I'm not hurting anybody but myself," kind of thing. Well, no. And I think that's what you're speaking to. They're hurting their loved ones as well. People are concerned. They're damaging their relationships. They're not showing up, depending on their age too. They might be in high school and they've went from being, getting good grades to getting terrible grades. You could be somebody older, in the workforce, and losing their job, losing their income. Not, loved ones can't depend on them anymore. They're lying. They're not showing up. They're not being responsible family members. And then their parents and their children are becoming emotionally damaged. They can't trust their parent, or their parents coming home. They don't know who's going to be walking through the door. And this is really a big source of psychological problems later on into adulthood. And when a child sees one of their caregivers, or both primary caregivers, are addicted to substances, for example, or even something else, could be gambling too, but let's say they don't know who's, let's say mother or father coming home, they don't know who's walking through the front door. Is it going to be nice happy daddy, or is it going to be mean daddy who's going to be yelling at mom, or threatening to hit me, or do I have to run and hide for safety? Or so there's really extreme, intense psychological consequences to the family members. If I understood more of your question perhaps too, was what's the effect on people, the user, the addicted person, depending on their age. And of course, as time goes by, I say of course, maybe it's not obvious, but in things like, let's say, typically in alcohol use or drug use, as time goes by and the person, let's say they survive and they're not in prison or getting, injured in car accidents or something like that, and they continue to use, over time, their brains suffer, their bodies suffer, have health consequences, nervous system consequences, mental health consequences. But on certain drugs, the use of certain drugs, anybody can die. It doesn't matter if you're 15 or 50, you can die of an overdose of heroin, opioids, benzodiazepines, and alcohol, for example.
Very interesting, Mr. Phillips. I think there is often a misunderstanding that the effects of addiction are limited to only of those of, let's say, drugs or some sort of substance dependence. Of course, that is a very large part of it, and why addiction has such a big name of being large, I guess, predator of a lot of people's minds, like teenagers. Oh, they might be affected by, let's say, vaping nowadays, more so than smoking, or perhaps juuling, these very small actions that add up to bigger consequences over time. And as someone that is aware of that, people at, let's say, high school, or maybe perhaps at a higher age, like adults, young adults, or perhaps maybe even younger than me, are maybe not necessarily addicted, but they're peer pressured into using these sorts of substances. Do you feel as if young people, such as teens, or perhaps even younger preteens, adolescents, or young adults, are what's the word? Affected or more susceptible to being addicted to certain types of things over others?
I think, well, one way to answer that would be, I think that's where one's social circle comes in to account. So, and I have some thoughts about this as well. People first start experimenting, generally speaking, or start experimenting with drugs and alcohol, in their sort of tween or 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. That is often when people start using, well, they're going through puberty, or they're socially awkward.
Just to be
And
clear,
yes.
is this referring to all people, or specifically people that do try these substances tend to be around this age?
I'm not quite sure that I understand that part of the
You
question.
said people that are this age start to experiment with like drugs or
Right.
alcohol. Is that representative of everyone, or specifically people that do get addicted often are introduced to these at
I
this
see what
time?
you're saying. Okay, yeah, great question. I think that's an age area, and again, it's not everybody, so I'm not saying this is across the board. That's when people sort of start experimenting, I think, with a lot of things, and also feeling more peer pressure. They're introduced to things that maybe somebody with an older siblings is, they're introduced to something by their older brother or sister, then they bring that to school or to their friend group. So I guess the answer is yes and yes. I think it goes for both people who are just experimenting, who don't get addicted, and people who get addicted to substances. So what happens is, I think it depends on what we're introduced to. So that has to do with where we live, who our friends are, and so on. It could be marijuana, it could be alcohol, it could be something much harder than that. It could be what I found in my parents' medicine chest, and and then what's available after that. So maybe now's a good time to kind of talk about how the brain gets addicted. So we have what's a substance which is released called dopamine, and that's a feel-good chemical which is released into neurotransmitter, which is released in our brain. And there's, by the way, footnote, there's a really good book if you're interested in exploring more about addiction. It's written by Dr. Anna Lembke. Her last name is spelled Lembke, and she wrote a book recently called Dopamine Nation. It's an excellent book. Talks about kind of what we're talking about, but on a much deeper level. It's a really good, really interesting book. And she says basically we are wired as human beings to become addicted to something. This is kind of the way we are. So, but we don't all get addicted, right? Addiction to substance use, alcohol and drugs is around, let's say, roughly around 10% of the population. But many more of us are addicted to other things, like we said, different behaviors, gambling, video games, shopping, and so on. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it just depends on what we're exposed to, what's introduced to us, and what our brain, the pleasure pathways that are engraved in our brain. What is doing that? Is it cocaine? Is it marijuana? Is it alcohol? Is it games? So what Dr. Lembke talks about in Dopamine Nation is that these pleasure pathways are sort of engraved into our brain, and it's very difficult. So it's difficult to kick that habit. That's where addiction comes in. So our prefrontal cortex, the logical part of the brain, is overridden by our subcortex, our limbic system.
I see.
So I'm not going to geek out too much here. This is where I can go kind of.
No, that was perfect.
Deep.
That was perfect.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Well, I think you mentioned earlier just about how teens can easily build a new habit of possibly being addicted to drugs. And I think I mentioned this in the question before that. A close person of mine is having a really bad time with addiction, and they're towards kind of like the middle-aged people, and he is a great, like, well, he is supposed to be kind of a role model for us, and how would it affect different age groups, I guess, to see the point of view of addiction. So like, how does being a child who's like 9 years old compared to a teen who's 16 years old see the view of addiction to drugs differently from each other?
I think what my co-host is trying to get across is how my different people in the person who's addicted's lives see and react to their addiction.
Right. That's a great question. Yeah. So again, it's gonna depend sort of on the awareness and maturity of each person, right? And then let's say the 9-year-old may be experiencing things less from an less intellectual place than, let's say, the 16-year-old. So what they're experiencing may be even kind of confusing because they're not really sure what's happening. And so they are navigating this relationship or relationships from a different place than, let's say, the 16-year-old, who is going to be more independent, is maybe more aware, has heard more stories, has seen people who are addicted, and they come, so their experience is going to be arguably quite different, as it would be in other areas of their lives. A 16-year-old, again, everybody's different, but a 16-year-old maybe is going to be more vocal, more verbal about their displeasure in this person's behaviors. The 9-year-old just might be a little bit more confused and not sure what to do. They might seek solace from, let's say, the 16-year-old if they're siblings, for example. And then, well, this is another thing too that can happen. Let's say a parent, let's say a mother, for example, who's often the primary caregiver in a family, is addicted to substances, or just not present because of that. There can be what's called parentification of the child or children. In this case, I would imagine the 16-year-old might take the place of the parent to be the parent, quote unquote, of the 9-year-old, for example. So then they're growing up. Often a child in an addicted family will grow up prematurely. They're taking on, they fill the void of one of the parents.
I see. Is there possibly some underlying genetic factors that maybe could cause addictions, or are they purely caused by environmental circumstances that maybe have affected someone's mental health?
No, it's both, certainly. The genetic component doesn't have to exist for somebody to become addicted. It is often in play. You can see it skip generations, or let's say there's, I see it a lot. Somebody will say, "Oh, I don't drink alcohol because my parents were both alcoholic," and yet they might have other addictive behaviors, which speaks to the idea of cross addictions, because you can have somebody who is addicted to, let's say, heroin, opioids, and they get clean. They're no longer using that drug, but they may, if their addictive behaviors are not treated, they will then often go to something else. It could be another substance, or it could be another type of behavior that they get from acting out. My approach to one belief of addiction too, as far as what's lacking, is we often say that what's lacking is connection. Like an antidote to addiction is connection. It's a human connection. Often we also talk about a void, having a spiritual void. There's a hole, a big hole that needs filling, and we fill it with dysfunctional behaviors or substances, and we feel at ease when that happens. I remember when I was a kid, when I was 12, 13 years old, being really shy and, going to go to the middle school dance, and somebody gave me some marijuana to try, and I tried it, and I was like, oh, I can do this. I can talk. I can dance, I can, whereas otherwise I might have been just standing against the wall as a shy 13 or 14-year-old. So, and then the brain goes, okay, that felt good. So next time I'm in this kind of a situation, I'm going to do that again. So I feel at ease. So I don't feel, there's not something missing. I feel more complete, so to speak.
So there's that association of that experience of using that drug and the effect as well of what happens after that drug is used, which basically cycles into the person going more and more. Very,
very well said. So it happens again, and maybe it's not an addiction yet. It's like, okay, that felt good. That's worked for me. Just what you're saying, yeah. And then we do it again, and then it becomes reinforced over time, and then the brain starts adopting, changing to that, how it reacts to that substance, and it wants more, and it wants it no matter what. It kind of perceives it as kind of a survival part of, yeah.
I see. Well, what are some examples of possibly some common addictions that teenagers and possibly other young people face right now? And also, what kind of risks might we experience if we were exposed to these types of drugs?
Maybe sometimes I can't, maybe you would be better to answer that question. You hear things that are going on, and in high school and stuff that I don't know. There's these new names of things that come up all the time. And so, but the classic ones are, benzodiazepines, the family of benzodiazepines, which is, Xanax and Ativan and those types of things, which are used to treat anxiety from a medical perspective. Unfortunately, they act on the brain in a very similar way as alcohol, and combined with alcohol, they can be deadly. There are people over the decades that have died, famous people, let's say, who have died because they combined benzodiazepines with alcohol. So obviously opioids as well can be lethal. We all know that. Opioids include heroin, which is an opiate. An opioid is a synthetic opiate. But opioids are the opiates are the same family. So heroin, things like Oxycontin, Vicodin, and these are often readily given out by doctors for, when they're not needed. I've gone to, a doctor and having a minor procedure or something, and I'm given, a prescription of 30 or 40 Vicodin, and I don't want them. I don't take them. I don't need them. A couple of Tylenol usually work fine for me. Marijuana, people think marijuana it's okay, it's legal, so it's fine, there's nothing wrong with it. Marijuana really has a deleterious effect on our brains, and especially adolescents, much more than adults. The adolescent brain is not fully formed. The prefrontal cortex is still forming. Generally in females, it's again, generally speaking, it's fully formed around the age of 25, and males around 28 or so years of age. So we are harming that brain as it's growing, and it can cause long-term damage, really, on our cognitive abilities. Also, the lungs. It's bad. Whether you're vaping or smoking marijuana, it can be harmful as well for our lungs and our hearts. So, over time, I think these are all very bad. Some can kill us quicker than others.
I see. Um, I that was a fabulous explanation of dependencies on things that are potentially fatal to our lives. But I feel like equal or perhaps even socially accepted, and both paradoxically more prominent and less prominent in our daily lives nowadays, is the over reliance, or maybe not reliance, but like spending too much time on, let's say, as we said earlier, video games or perhaps social media, or sites such as YouTube, where as soon as one thing is over, we just keep going on to the next and going on and on and on. And personally, in my social circles, I feel like I see that a lot, that a lot of people are either unable to see that these are harmful to their lives, or perhaps are negatively affected, but they choose to ignore those signs, even though it has a negative effect on their life. And even for me, sometimes I feel like I have fallen into this trap of doing things, uh, perhaps electronically or through social media, that, and I realize that I'm doing it too much. For something so widespread, Mr. Phillips, do you think that there's a solution to ameliorate this stigma of, or perhaps maybe not stigma, but to help out this such a prevalent thread throughout our society today? Something that we can do about something that's so ingrained in our lives?
Yeah, great question. And the social media and YouTube, as you said, it's everywhere, and it's people your age, it's people my age. I mean, we can't sit still. A lot of us can't sit still and just think about something. We have to pick up our phone and look at our phone and scroll. And of course, there's more and more. I mean, the stuff that's coming out now about Facebook and Instagram and so on, and how they've targeted, small children, or younger people, I should say, to try to hook them. It's all about the dopamine. It's all about dopamine hits, micro dopamine hits, the rush, the little rush of getting liked, of feeling validated, or it's so. What, as the society, I'm not sure what we can do. I think there are people trying to address it. It's at certain levels. I think it's a battle that's is very difficult to win. And what does winning mean? Again, that might be subjective. What one can do individually is stop. So very simple, right?
It sounds like such an easy thing, but it's really not.
So the way the brain works, again, talking about dopamine and so on, and releases and changing there's something called plasticity of the brain. The brain can change. So these pleasure pathways that have been, like grooves in a record, can be changed. And the general rule of thumb is 30 days, that if we stop something or change our behavior for 30 days, the brain starts sort of repairing itself and healing and changing. The pleasure pathways can change. So what's important, I think, is to replace the unhealthy behaviors, actions, habits into something that's more healthy. We can find pleasure in other ways. It might not be as a rush, like you said, but we can find pleasure elsewhere. It might be more of I don't know, feeling good about getting good grades, for example. You know, I haven't been on my phone or on YouTube or video gaming all hours of the night. I actually sat and studied. And what do you know? There's a real reward to that. You know, there's a real reward to having human connections and talking to our families and our siblings and talking to friends rather than just engaging via social media.
So it's almost like a counter addiction, or not, maybe not an addiction, but like building
Positive
habits
behaviors.
that counter them.
It's positive behavior. Yeah, I wouldn't call it an addiction necessarily, but sure. I mean, consciously positive behaviors rather than mindless addictive behaviors.
Yeah.
I see. Well, we've been talking about the effects of drugs and also the possible damage it can cause to not only the drug user, but also those who are related to the drug user as well. So I just have two questions based on having a loved one that is currently fighting their drug substance abuse right now. So my first question is, when is the right possible time to seek help? And second of all, how could you give us maybe some ways that we can help our family member who is battling through the drug abuse? Just any ways that can maybe help them leading to the road into recovery if they keep persistently refuse on treatment.
Yeah. First of all, I'm very sorry that you are experiencing this. It's tragic, and it's, you know, I've experienced this myself, and I work with families, and it's really sad and anger provoking, and really frustrating and very confusing. To wonder, why is this person doing this? They know they're hurting themselves and those around them that love them, and but the addiction is stronger than their will, and self-will does not self-will and self-knowledge aren't enough necessarily to stop the addictive behaviors. So when's the right time? The right time is when they acknowledge that when somebody acknowledges I've got a problem. Do they tend to go when they first acknowledge they have a problem? No. Unfortunately, they have to have what we call a bottom, you know, something bad happens, like they get in a car accident, they lose their job, they lose their family, they lose their house, there's a loss, they hurt somebody, they hurt themselves. And then they're really desperate. They maybe have that gift, some people call a gift of desperation. So they're desperate for help. Up until then, they think they could manage it. That's very typical of an addict. I got this, I can manage it. I'm not hurting anybody else. It's just me, et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop it after the holidays, or I'm just gonna drink and when I go to the Dodger games, or, you know, on and on and on and on and on. There's a great book called The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which talks about this. It was written in the 30s. It's really good though, and it's very things haven't changed. You know, the society has changed somewhat, but addiction hasn't changed since that book was written. And then, so if the person is going to do it on their own, there's what's called an intervention. You may have seen that show that was on TV, might still be on, I'm not sure, but having an intervention where the family members get together, either on their own or with a professional. It's usually recommended doing it with a professional. And there's different ways of doing it. And often, you know, the family gathers together, family and loved ones gather together, and they talk to the person and maybe write them a letter, like, I love you, but this has got to stop. I'm really concerned. If you don't stop, these are the consequences. I'm going to leave, or, I'm going to stop talking to you because I can't stand by and watch you destroy yourself, for example. So the recommendation is to hire somebody. They're not, unfortunately, they tend to be quite expensive, but to seek professional help, to seek professional advice. There are people who specialize in this. That's what they do. They help people get into treatment and help family members to strategize around how to do that.
That's honestly amazing, Mr. Phillips. That how much that each individual person in a person whose life who may be addicted to something that they could it's kind of cheesy to say, but they could reach out and in from a place of love really express that they think that the person who's affected by the addiction really needs help.
Mm-hmm.
In a similar vein, do you feel as if something in your life has compelled you to go this direction to help other people with their addictions, or is there some sort of history that you have with these sorts of things?
Yeah, good question. I think most people, helpers, people in the helping professions, healing professions, are people who have experienced firsthand their own issues with mental health or addiction, or something like that. I think most families have to some extent. Anyway, most people. So yeah, in my personal life, I come from what I like to call an addicted family system. I had a parent who was an alcoholic who died at a young age in his 50s. I've had grandparents. I've had extended family members who have also succeeded in beating their addiction and getting sober and helping others. My great aunt founded the first recovery home for women in the world, and that was in 1951 in Koreatown. It's called Friendly House, and it still exists. It's the oldest recovery home for women. And they're a nonprofit, and they still do wonderful work. And so her name was B, Aunt B, and she, as a kid growing up, she would tell me stories about her trials and tribulations with addiction. In fact, they made a movie about her back in 1984, I think, or around that time, called Life of the Party. So yeah, I've had my own issues as well with addiction, which I came through back in 2009. And interestingly enough, I was in the wine trade internationally. I sold wine for over 2 decades, and then I decided it was time for me to change my path, and I got sober, and then I went back to school in grad school and studied clinical psychology and became a therapist, and now I'm able to help others who have the same struggles, with similar struggles.
So what kind of process so you mentioned how there are different types of recovery programs, and you also mentioned about the first female recovery house in 1951, I believe. And so in what ways could a therapist like you and many others, or a psychologist, might be able to help someone suffering from addictions, both mentally and physically? What kind of process does the drug user go through in these programs that can help them to lead to a pathway of recovery?
Yeah. Simple question. There's no simple answer, but I will try. Let's see. Well, first of all, a person has to sort of admit they have to want to get help. So they have to, the first thing, it's like step one in the 12 steps. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Our lives have become unmanageable. So what does that mean? It means that I admit that I'm powerless over alcohol. Powerlessness, I can be broken down. I like to break it down anecdotally to when I pick up, I can't put down. So I tell myself I'm going to have just one beer, but I have that one beer and I end up having 10 beers. So when I pick up, I can't put down. I'm powerless over the ability to control when I drink or not, how much I drink or use or video game or whatever, you know, or gamble or whatever. So that's the first part of powerlessness. The second part of powerlessness, I like to say, is even when I do put it down, I can't leave it alone. So this speaks to the obsession. So let's say I white knuckle it, I put it down, or I'm in the hospital or I'm in jail or something, I stop. You know, I'm not drinking or using on a regular basis. But, and this is where I talk about that void, that hole that needs filling. I'm not feeling complete. Or lack of having coping skills, coping mechanism to live life on life's terms. So I might be doing okay, and then something contrary happens, or you know, I get a bad grade in school, or my boyfriend breaks up with me, or you know, something, you know, my grandma passes away, or something, you know, fill in the blank of something that's uncomfortable. And my go-to is to drink or to gamble or to do something. So the second part is, even when I do put it down, I can't leave it alone because I have not developed any other coping skills. So maybe part of the answer to your question is we help people get coping skills, develop coping skills on how to live daily without turning to these dysfunctional behaviors as for solutions to living life. I highly recommend 12-step programs. The original 12-step program was Alcoholics Anonymous is still. There's other ones. There's Narcotics Anonymous. There's Cocaine Anonymous. There's Gamblers Anonymous. There's MA, Marijuana Anonymous, and on and on and on. There's Overeaters Anonymous, and you name it. Oh, eating is can be another way of filling that void as well. So, yeah. So generally in a rehab facility, there's groups, there's individual therapy, there's counseling, drug, counseling, or whatever our addiction is to. We have people counseling us. Could be, if it's eating, there's eating. If it's porn or whatever, there's different counselors that specialize in those types of behaviors. And then we have group therapy. We have outings. We read different sort of. We learn, we learn about ourselves, and we learn about how to function on a higher level.
I see. That's been a really helpful insight to those who possibly want to seek help, not only for themselves, but for their family members, including myself. I thought it was really insightful and detailed of what you explained there. And it helped me a lot with what I possibly might provide myself, and also to my family members. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Phillips. How might our listeners be able to find your services or any other outlets that you might have?
Good question. I have a website, and it's rossphillipstherapy.com. I would suggest for those who are looking to help their loved ones who are or want to get help themselves, there's something called Al-Anon, ALANON, and I think the website is alanon.org. That is an excellent, it's a 12-step program. I'm a big fan of 12-step programs. It's a spiritual solution. Doesn't mean it's religious, but it can function if you are religious. It works great. If not, that's fine too. But it offers a solution to living life on life's terms, whether we are dealing with an alcoholic or an addict, alanon.com, AA or .org, I think it is. AA.org is another one. There's another mental health site, which I really like, called NAMI, NAMI.org. And that's, I believe it stands for National Association of Mental Illness. And they have a lot of great resources. Yeah, and you could, feel free to shoot me an email, and I could help put you in the right direction for help if I can.
That's amazing, Mr. Phillips. Before we end off, do you have any last things that you'd like to say to our audience?
No matter who you are, you're not alone, whether you are addicted to something yourself or are witnessing, you have a family member who is, there is help out there in a variety of forms, rehab, as I said, therapy, 12-step programs. Again, I'm a great believer in 12-step programs. We don't have to stay isolated. We don't have to stay quiet. There are people out there who are like us and whose stories are very similar to our own. And you can find those in a variety of meetings. There's meetings online, there's meetings in person for virtually every type of addiction, or for family members of people who are addicted. So you don't have to be alone. You don't have to live in silence with these and keep these problems a secret.
You heard the man, audience. Well, thank you again so much, Mr. Phillips. If any of our listeners would like to see more of us, we're on Instagram at @lot_foundation, and please consider donating to our PayPal. We have a lot of projects here at the Laugh Out Together Foundation, and we would highly appreciate your contributions to our work. Thank you again, Mr. Phillips.
Yeah, and thank you. And anything I can do to help you guys out, let me know. It's admirable what you're doing, and I appreciate your invitation. Thank you.
We hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as we did, and see you in the next episode of the Mental Hotline.